Well, thank you very much for joining this week on our channel that's dedicated to history, traveling through history. And this week we have a very special episode for you. We got a lot of fantastic feedback from our last two episodes. One of them was about the spies in the American Revolution, and the second one was about the main person in the culper spy ring who nobody knows the identity of, and that's Agent 355. Both of those episodes really got us a lot of acclaim, and we got a lot of feedback that they wanted to see what we could put together for the spies of the American Civil War. And so that's what our episode is this week, and we're really excited about what we've put together for you. As you can see in the backdrop behind me, we've got Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. They were the presidents of the two warring sides, one the North and one the South. And just like George Washington in the large war before this one, the American Revolution, they realized the importance of spies, and they realized the importance of espionage and understanding what the other side was doing and getting clandestine information, and also putting out misinformation and propaganda. And so in this episode, we're going to explore how spying in the Civil War became even more important than it was in the Revolutionary War. Both sides were doing it. There were spies all over the place. You had to be really careful with what you said and who you said it to. And also introduced in the Civil War, interestingly enough, and we'll show this at the end of the program, there were a lot of really cool new spy techniques and new spy technology that were brought into the war that made the spying that took place even more sophisticated. One thing I would mention that was interesting was, unlike George Washington, who had a centralized spy operation in the American Revolution, in the Civil War, both of the presidents you can see behind me, Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, went with a more distributed approach. They didn't have a centralized spy operation. They had a network of different operations. So in the case of Lincoln, he appointed each of his individual generals to then appoint their own spy chief. So you essentially had, 20 different Union generals, all with 20 different spy chiefs, which is a really interesting way to do it. And all of them had spying and espionage responsibility. The South did something similar. However, the South was a little bit better early in the war. From 1861 to 1863, the South was clearly outspying the North. They had a lot more sympathizers, especially in Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Maryland. All through those states, the South was definitely dominating when it came to information and getting that information to the people that needed it on the front lines. So the Union definitely caught up in 1863 and for the rest of the war, but the Confederacy did have a decided advantage early on. So let's talk a little bit about the spying in the Civil War. And what we'll do is we'll just go through some information here. Initially, we're going to also go through a couple of short videos. And after those two short videos, we'll come back and talk about it on the other side. And then, as always in this program, one of our favorite segments is the 25 little known facts. And we're going to do 25 little known facts about spying in the American Civil War. So hopefully you enjoy that. So in terms of spying, tactical and battlefield intelligence became vital to both sides of the war in the American Civil War. Units of spies and scouts reported directly to commanders of armies in the field, which again was a very decentralized model compared to other wars. They provided troop details, troop movements, troop strengths, tactics, other secret information like which general was going to be operating on which battlefield, what was the troop strength at the time, what was the morale of the troops, what was their supply line situation. Even something as simple as learning what supply lines look like and whether a troop movement into the field was supported by backup troops and also supplies was a really important aspect to every battle. The distinction between spies and scouts was a very interesting one in the Civil War. So spies were deemed as enemy combatants and could actually be executed if they were caught behind enemy lines, whereas scouts were considered part of the troops or one of the soldiers and had to be treated humanely and had to be, if captured, held in captivity until the end of the war. So very important distinction there. And a lot of the rancor that happened around when spies were caught was whether they truly were a spy or whether they were a scout and actually part of a military unit. And a lot of times spies would try to disguise themselves as a scout so that if they ever got caught, they wouldn't be executed. So that was an interesting aspect of the war, is always trying to determine which one they were. So a spy named Will Talbot, a member of the 35th Battalion in the Virginia Cavalry, was left behind in Gettysburg after the battalion had passed through a borough on June 26th and 27th in 1863. He was captured and he was taken to Emmitsburg, Maryland, and he was executed on the orders of Brigadier General John Buford. This was a big deal because he was actually carrying the flag of a scout at the time, and they charged him as a spy and executed him. And so this was an example of one of the situations where it was really kind of a gray line on which one he should have been. In terms of Confederate spying at the time, intelligence gathering really focused mainly around Alexandria, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Richmond, of course, a little further south from D.C., was the capital of the Confederacy. And so the Confederates established what they called a secret line. And the secret line was this chain of human beings that made up the spy ring for the South. It was a loose group of people that would hand off information to each other from one tavern to the next, from one farm to the next. And it would hand off to somebody. They would carry it about 10 miles and they would give it to somebody else. So they called it the secret line. And we'll show you a detailed map of that secret line later in the program. But essentially, it ran from Richmond, Virginia, up to Baltimore, Maryland, and back, and was constantly flowing information through that secret line backwards and forwards. So that information was flowing from the north to the south and the south to the north and getting to the generals that needed it. So in terms of that network that I was just talking about, it was established by Thomas Jordan, who was an operative for the Confederacy, worked directly for Jefferson Davis. And he recruited probably the most important agent for the South, and that was a woman named Rose O'Neal Greenhow. And Rose O'Neal Greenhow, we'll talk in detail later in the program, but she was a key and critical component because she could get away with, being a domestic woman with children, a homemaker. She had a really good cover for all of her clandestine activities that she did for Thomas Jordan. So she would deliver reports to Jordan through the secret line, through her secret set of operatives that she had been recruiting for the last 2 years. Secret line, of course, being the chain of human beings that she would pass them through, but also started to become the name of the actual network that they were working in. They mainly had a challenge trying to get the documents back and forth from Richmond to Baltimore because there were two massive rivers in the way. And so they had to really work on logistics to get them across those rivers. One of them being the Potomac River, which is right next to Washington, D.C. and flows out to the ocean. And of course, we have also the Rappahannock River that they had to deal with. And so caused a lot of logistical headaches for the South as they were moving their information through the secret line. Also, they had another group called the Signal Corps that was devoted primarily to communications and intercepts. This was a smaller group, worked directly with the secret line, but was its own little group, and worked on everything to do with intercepting information the North was trying to pass from their spies, and also pushing out information into the secret line itself, and also misinformation. Actually, sometimes intelligence was intentionally done incorrectly so that the wrong information would get to the generals on the other side. And then also there were some northern networks that were trying to counter these networks, both in Washington, D.C. and in Maryland, and even some that had crept into northern Virginia to try to counter. But like I said before, most of the northern networks were reporting directly to the northern generals themselves. In terms of other Union spying activities, the primary person who set up a network was Alan Pinkerton. He was a detective and had his own detection agency up in Chicago, Illinois, and had become very famous even before the war, had a reputation of being one of the best spy networks that was a privately owned company. And he got tapped by General George McClellan on the Union side to set up what he called the United States Secret Service, a precursor to the current Secret Service that we have. This was a small group that just reported to McClellan, nobody else. So it was almost like his private spy agency run by Alan Pinkerton. Another spy master for the Union, as I told you, was a decentralized model, was Lafayette C. Baker. And if you asked Baker or Pinkerton, they both would tell you that they were the head of the spy services for the Union. So even though it was a decentralized situation. Both of them thought they were the head of the whole thing. He actually conducted intelligence and security work for Lieutenant General Winfred Scott, and that's who he took his orders from. In addition, President Lincoln hired his own spy chief, who was a third kind of master of the entire operation, and his name was William Alvin Lloyd, reporting directly to President Lincoln. And Lloyd would often go into the South itself. He would go down into Virginia and North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and take a little crew with him, and he would gather intelligence and then bring it back directly to Lincoln. So as you can see, not only did Lincoln's generals have their own spy chiefs, but Lincoln had his own as well. In terms of Ulysses S. Grant, who was the primary brigadier general for the Army later in the war from 1863 on, he appointed John C. Fremont as his spy master. And Fremont became a very brutal operator. He really would be, kind of like a CIA operator today. He recruited a number of intelligence officers from throughout the Army. And later in the war, as I told you, the South was doing much better early in the war, but the Union really had the decided advantage later in the war. And it was largely because of these men who were very good at what they did, especially Fremont for Ulysses S. Grant. So you can see, in terms of spying in the American Civil War, it was really quite a competition. As we mentioned in the American Revolution episode, often battles were decided either won or lost based on the intelligence. And we saw that even more in the Civil War. There were some really great victories and some catastrophic situations that could have been avoided if there had been better intelligence. And some of the wars that actually were won within the Civil War itself were actually because of great intelligence. So there really were some great operators. So that's a little bit of background about Civil War spying and espionage. Really, really exciting topic. We hope you dig into it a little bit more. We're going to now take a look at 2 short videos, and then we will come back on the other side and talk about them.
Although Army infantry brigades were very important to military operations in the Civil War, spies were more crucial. Spies had the power to sway military operations by finding enemy plans and using those to outsmart them. Intelligence collection in the South relied on the Confederate secret line. The line ran from the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, up to Washington, D.C., and then on to Baltimore, Maryland. This route was a quick and easy way to get information from Southern sympathizers who held a seat in Congress or in federal bureaucracies and had great access to information in Washington. One of the most famous Confederate spies was Bell Boyd. On July 3, 1861, Bell was at the family estate in Virginia when a group of Union soldiers attempted to raise the American flag over the estate. One of the Union soldiers disrespected Bell's mother, and she drew a pistol and shot him. Bell faced no repercussions except that the estate was guarded by Union soldiers. Bell seduced one of the guards and pressed him for information about Union military plans. She then took the info and gave it to Confederate officers. Bell also volunteered to take Confederate papers across the Atlantic Ocean to England. Pictured above is Rose O'Neal Greenhow. Rose was one of the most successful Confederate spies. Some attribute the Confederate victory at the Battle of Bull Run to her. She and her friend were responsible for delivering the note for reinforcements to General Beauregard. This, presumably along with good tactics, cost the Union the battle. In the war, both sides started to advance technologically. The South followed the North's role in developing a cipher cylinder. Cipher cylinders were used to decode encrypted messages. This method was much faster than decoding a message by hand, and it made it much easier. Intelligence collection in the North was much different than in the South. The North didn't practice mass collection. They didn't have one single route that spies traded information on. Generals rather employed spies that collected for their units. These generals, pictured above, would have spies that would gather intelligence for their units. This is perhaps one of the greatest differences between intelligence collection in the North and the South. Price Lewis was an English-born Union spy. On June 29, 1861, he was riding on the Kanawha Turnpike when he was brought to Colonel Patton. He befriended Patton and got him to talk by giving him champagne. Later, when he was at his hotel, Price took out his notepad and recorded everything the colonel had told him. Soon after, Price began working for Alan Pinkerton, head of Pinkerton Detective Agency, which did much of their work for the Union. He did the same to many high-ranking Confederate officers, gaining valuable secrets for the North. Another method used by the North and South was hot air balloons. The North's balloon corps was much better organized and advanced over the South's. The North used these balloons to spy upon Confederate armies. These balloons could see the troops a day in advance. One of the most famous balloons was the Intrepid. The Intrepid could hold up to 5 men in the air. These balloons were specially built for military purposes. It is arguable that these balloons that were utilized by both the North and the South was the nation's first Air Force. Pictured above is Colonel Charles P. Stone. Colonel Stone was not a spy himself, but he used a spy to expose an unloyal captain in the Union Army. Captain Schaefer had an unprecedented amount of artillery, sabers, and revolvers, all of which an infantry should not have. Stone used an agent to infiltrate the company and find out the captain's true intentions. It proved to be a very successful operation in exposing a mole in the army.
Harriet Tubman, former slave and leader in the Underground Railroad, was also a Union spy, and the first woman in U.S. history to lead a military expedition. Here's how. After escaping slavery herself, Harriet Tubman rescued slaves throughout the 1850s. And when the Civil War started, she offered her services to the Union war effort. In 1863, she was assigned to Colonel James Montgomery to work for the Union Army as a nurse, cook, and spy. Tubman disguised herself as an aging woman and moved behind Confederate lines unnoticed, gathering information from a network of informants. Slaves traded information in exchange for a chance at freedom, and sometimes cash. The covert operation was approved by President Abraham Lincoln and run by Secretary of State William Seward. In South Carolina, Tubman worked in Union-controlled contraband camps, where escaped slaves sought safety. There, she recruited local informants and found out where other slaves were being held. Tubman and other spies would gather intel about Confederate plans, such as where they had dropped barrels filled with gunpowder to attack Union boats. On June 1, 1863, alongside Colonel Montgomery, she led 300 black soldiers to raid rice plantations along the Combahee River in South Carolina, making her the first woman in American history to plan and lead a military operation. The soldiers ransacked the plantation, setting fire to buildings and freeing more than 700 slaves. Tubman continued to work as a nurse, cook, and spy for another year, but she was only paid $200 for her entire war service, and was never paid all of the benefits owed to her, despite multiple appeals to the federal government. It wasn't until 1890, 2 years after her husband's death, that she received a small pension for being the widow of a war veteran. And it wasn't until 1899 that her pension was increased, but that didn't make up for the benefits she deserved. It would take another 100 years for Tubman to get the money she was owed, when in 2002 Congress was again alerted about the pension, and soon after provided $11,750 to the Harriet Tubman home in Auburn, New York.
So as you saw there, lots of great tidbits out of both of those videos. The first thing I'd like to mention is, as you saw in the first video, the two most important spies for the South were both women, Belle Boyd and Rose Greenhow. Really amazing to see the same thing happening in the Civil War that happened in the American Revolution, which is women were, in a lot of ways, much more effective spies because they were under the radar. They weren't suspected. But many of them were housewives, didn't have jobs, were not politically astute, and were kind of disregarded by men. And so individual who are operators like Belle Boyd and Greenhow were just incredibly effective. And and built huge networks of people to be able to pass information back and forth for the South. Same thing happened on the northern side. There were lots of women on that side as well. And so that was one thing I wanted to point out. The other thing you heard in the video confirming what I said earlier, and that is that the Union had a much more distributed model, having each of their generals with their own spy masters and their own spy networks. Whereas the South was much more coordinated, much more organized through Greenhow, through Bell Boyd, through Thomas Jordan, all of them working together on the secret line and working in one kind of unison unit. So that was an interesting aspect there. Also wanted to mention with Harriet Tubman in her video, just think about how amazing this woman was. Most people know her for the Underground Railroad and her rescuing of 700 slaves, which was by itself an unbelievable accomplishment that she did there. But on top of that, she was a nurse and she was a spy, and she was bringing important information back to Lincoln by infiltrating southern areas down in South Carolina and Georgia. She also, as you heard there, was the first woman in U.S. history to lead a military operation, which was really incredible. I actually did not realize that until I started doing the research for this program. So Harriet Tubman, an amazing woman as well, and what a story in terms of her spying that she did for the Union. So as always, so fascinating to delve into all these different stories and look at all the different espionage aspects of this war. So now let's take a look at our 25 little known facts. I think you're going to really enjoy this, and we'll go through each one of them individually. All right, so number one, the tale of two White Houses, espionage during the American Civil War. In the 19th century, two mansions were sitting approximately 100 miles apart. One called the White House in Washington, D.C., and the other one, the reconstruction of the White House down in Richmond, Virginia. So during the 1812 war, British troops had burned that building to the ground and reoccupied it in 1817. The following year, a smaller three-story neoclassical style private mansion was constructed in Richmond, Virginia that would later become the Confederate White House in 1861. During the Civil War, both mansions functioned as office space, site for ceremonies, home for the president and his family. These executive mansions represented competing ideals of the Union and Confederacy and were home to their respective leaders. President Abraham Lincoln, who's there on the left, and the White House in Washington, D.C., right next to him, and President Jefferson Davis, who's there on the right, and the Confederate White House that was in Richmond, Virginia. The success of either side was aided by military intelligence, which was acquired through troop surveys, prisoner interrogations, personal conversations, and reports from secret organizations. Between 1861 and 1865, spies on both sides of the war played important roles in acquiring and transmitting intelligence. Spycraft was not only planned, but was also carried out at these executive mansions themselves. So you can imagine the amount of attention that was getting paid at these two very important houses with these two men and their staffs and all the intelligence that could have been passed back and forth. Number two, William A. Lloyd was a Lincoln's personal spy. So we mentioned him a little bit earlier, but here's a picture of him. During the summer of 1861, Lincoln sought the services of William A. Lloyd, who became his personal intelligence operative. Before working for Lincoln, Lloyd published railroad and steamboat schedules in the southern states. And when the war began, Lloyd was unable to travel to the Confederacy without a passport. Upon reviewing Lloyd's application, President Lincoln saw an opportunity to employ Lloyd because of his frequent trips to Confederate states in the past. So Lincoln offered to issue a passport and a monthly salary if Lloyd agreed to serve as his personal spy. Lloyd provided many types of information to the president, including maps of Confederate camps and forts, details about supplies in Richmond, information pertaining to General Robert E. Lee's forces. Lloyd continued as a valuable informant throughout the war and gained trust with the Confederate side undercover as a traveling salesman. During this entire time, he was assisted in his spying endeavors by his employee, Mr. Boyd. The efforts of the two men to collect intelligence are impressive, but their problem was getting the data back to Lincoln in a timely manner. You can imagine back then, with the transportation not so great, the communication avenues were not very good. You can imagine it would have been difficult to get it back quickly. So by their contract, the information had to go directly to President Lincoln himself, and nobody else could see it. They even resorted to sending letters to Boyd's family and then his brother, would take them personally to the White House for delivery to President Lincoln. The information that Lloyd and his associates sent to Lincoln was not shared by the president with his military commanders, and it appears he used it as a quality check on his commanders. So you can see Lincoln wasn't completely trusting of his commanders and was always doing quality checks or kind of back channel checks on what they were saying and whether it was true. Number 3, Lafayette C. Baker worked for the Union behind enemy lines. He traveled to Washington, D.C. from San Francisco, California to offer his services to Union General William Winfield Scott at the outbreak of the Civil War. On July 11th, 1861, under the alias Samuel Munson, Baker embarked on one of his most critical missions. His orders were to gather information about the Black Horse Cavalry at Manassas Junction and to learn the location and strength of Confederate troops in Richmond, Virginia. While undercover, he concealed his identity even among Union troops because, according to Baker, to let Union troops into the secret would be to send it to Richmond before I had reached Manassas. So you can see he really didn't trust his own troops that they would keep it secret. So he just kept it secret from everybody. Traveling by foot, Baker penetrated Confederate lines in Manassas and shortly afterwards was suspected of being a spy and arrested. Nevertheless, he collected information about the troops and surveyed 200-person Black Horse Cavalry. As a prisoner, Baker traveled by train to Richmond, where he was questioned directly by Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Wouldn't you like to be a spy in that room to listen in on what Jefferson Davis was asking Baker? Throughout the interrogations, Baker revealed only as much information as necessary to placate accusations of espionage and maintain his identity as Samuel Munson. Owing to some luck and his skill, the Confederates released Baker, and he traveled back to Washington, D.C. Upon his return, after an absence of 3 weeks, Baker reported to General Scott on a number of troops and resources at Manassas and Richmond. He also orchestrated the capture of the notorious Confederate spy Belle Boyd, who frequently traveled to Union camps from her home in Martinsburg, Virginia. So Belle Boyd, we're going to spend some time on a little later, but you can see he was the reason that she got caught, his network. So pretty interesting stuff there. Number 4, Belle Boyd. Let's talk about her. She was the most notorious and effective Confederate spy of them all. On July 4th, 1861, you heard in the video, Belle shot and killed a Union soldier outside her home, who, according to her memoir, had accosted her mother and insulted her mother. She was never punished for her actions, and Union guards were stationed around the Boyd residence to ensure their safety. In the event that someone might try to harm Belle or her mother in retaliation. So Belle was in frequent contact with Union officers who were guarding her home. Due to her proximity to those officers, she overheard important information regarding the positions and plans of the Union Army. As she stated in her post-war memoir, whatever I heard, I regularly and carefully committed to paper, and whenever an opportunity offered, I sent my secret dispatch by a trusty messenger. So even though she was kind of in house arrest, she was constantly listening and writing things down and sending them out as reports into the secret line. So Belle also confiscated Union weapons and smuggled them into Confederate camps. In October 1861, she served as a courier for General Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson. And on May 23, 1862, she rushed to inform General Jackson that several divisions of the Union Army would cooperate to defeat the Confederates in the pending Battle of Fort Royal in Virginia. According to Belle, she hurried across the battlefield as rifle balls flew thick and fast around me, and more than one struck the ground so near my feet as to throw dust in my eyes. After dodging Union and Confederate crossfire to complete her mission, Belle was later recognized for her bravery and contribution to the Confederate victory in the form of a personal letter from General Jackson. So you can see Belle was quite the operator. She was very active. Whenever she could get information into the secret line, she did. She also, as you see, participated in several of the battle victories for the Confederacy. Number 5, Virginia's Governor John Letcher was the spy master for the Confederacy. So he was located 60 miles south of the Mason-Dixon line, Washington, D.C., full of Southern sympathizers when the Civil War broke out in 1861. So Virginia's Governor John Letcher, who was a former congressman, used his knowledge of the city to set up a nascent spy network in the capital in late April 1861, after his state seceded, but before it actually joined the Confederacy. Two of the most prominent early recruits were Thomas Jordan, who we talked about earlier as kind of the head spy for the secret line network. And Thomas Jordan was a West Point graduate stationed in Washington before the war. And then, of course, he recruited Rose O'Neill Greenhow, who we've spoken about in this program already, who was an openly pro-South widow and socialite who was friendly with a number of Northern politicians, including Secretary of State William Seward and Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson. Letcher also appointed Robert E. Lee, who had just resigned as colonel in the U.S. Army, as commander-in-chief of Virginia's Army and Navy forces in April 22nd of 1861, at the grade of Major General. On April 24th, 1861, Virginia and the Confederate States agreed that Virginia forces would be under the overall direction of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, pending the completion of the process of Virginia joining the Confederate States. So you can see Virginia Governor John Letcher was very much part of the transition from succession to joining the Confederacy, to naming Thomas Jordan the head of the spy network, to naming Robert E. Lee as one of the primary generals for the Confederacy. So he was right in the middle of all of it. Number 6, Rose O'Neill Greenhow spied for the Confederates. She's one example of how spies functioned as intermediaries who passed along information to field commanders. You see a picture of her there with her daughter. She would use that cover as being the homemaker and the mother, often to not arouse suspicion as to her activities. She also aided Confederate cause, and like Bell, she actually was captured by Union officials. She lived in the heart of Washington's most affluent social circles and made the acquaintance of prominent figures such as First Lady Dolly Madison, President James Buchanan, and Vice President James C. Calhoun. In July 1861, Greenhow sent coded reports across the Potomac to Thomas Jordan concerning the planned federal invasion. One of her couriers, a young woman named Betty Duval, dressed as a farm girl in order to pass Union sentinels on the chain bridge leaving Washington, then rode at high speed to Fairfax Courthouse in Virginia to deliver her message to Confederate officers stationed there. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard later credited the information from Greenhow with helping his rebel army win a surprise victory in the First Battle of Bull Run on July 21st, 1861. On July 23rd, 2 days later, Rose received a letter from Colonel Jordan stating, "Our President and our General direct me to thank you. We rely upon you for further information. The Confederacy owes you a debt." In 1863, 2 years later, Rose published My Imprisonment and the First Year of Abolition Rule at Washington, which describes her acts of espionage, observations of the event in the Lincoln White House, including First Lady Mary Lincoln's February 9th, 1862 ball, and heightened White House security in case of attack by Confederate forces. She also discussed her time under house arrest less than a mile away from the executive mansion. So it must have been very interesting. She was under arrest, couldn't go anywhere because of her spying activities, and yet she was only a mile from the White House. So we've spoken about Thomas Jordan. He was a critical spy for the South and kind of the lead spy for the spy network that was going right through Washington, D.C. He was a Confederate general and major operative in the network of Confederate spies, a career soldier in the armies of 3 nations. He had previously fought in the Mexican-American War, and in 1868 was appointed as chief of staff of the Cuban Insurgent Army, which fought to achieve independence from Spain. He resigned in 1870 and returned to the United States, where he settled in New York City. Jordan was also a newspaper editor and author, writing articles about the American Civil War. As early as 1860, he joined Governor Letcher of Virginia and secretly began pro-Southern spy network in Washington, D.C. So you can see 5 years before the Civil War, they were already setting up the apparatus and the network and recruiting people, getting a pro-spy network for the South ready. So this network eventually became particularly active after secession, and in early 1861, Jordan passed control of his espionage network to Rose O'Neill Greenhow. However, he continued to receive and evaluate her reports after she was restricted to house arrest. He appeared to be her Confederate Secret Service handler during the formative phase of Confederate intelligence and recruited operatives. So really, really key person here. He and Rose were kind of the linchpin of the entire operation. So here's a map of the secret line network of spies and informants for the South operating between Richmond, Virginia and Baltimore, Maryland. You can see the map there that it was essentially about 150 miles total between the two cities, with two major rivers they had to cross, and of course, Washington, D.C. being the main target for most of their espionage gathering, going north and going south. The entire network was set up by over 1,500 agents that would hand off to each other in all the different locations and states. Delivery of ciphered reports to Thomas Jordan involved ever-changing secret line, which was the name of the system used to get letters, intelligence reports, and other documents across the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers into the hands of Confederate officers and officials. For Rose Greenhow, the secret line began with a courier to whom she would entrust her reports. He or she would then hand those off to the next link in the chain of men and women who slipped in and out of taverns, shops, farms, and waterfront docks along the route that connected Baltimore and Washington to the home of the Confederacy in Richmond. It's really a pretty sophisticated network, and what they were doing there over a course of a couple of years was really supplying the South with what they needed. Number 8, Betty Duval. You just heard her name. She was working with Greenhow directly, was a Confederate spy courier. That's a picture of her there. Betty Hamilton Duval, she was from Washington, D.C., was the daughter of Eli Duval and Sarah Duval. She was descended from the immigrant Maureen Duval. Washington, D.C.-based spy Rose O'Neill Greenhow gave her a note about a Union plan for the First Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run, to give to General P.G.T. Beauregard. Duval carried it and tucked it in her hair and posed as a farm girl to get through British checkpoints, and then rode her horse to Fairfax County Courthouse in Virginia to deliver her message to Confederate officers who were stationed there. She continued to be a spy, and she recruited her cousin to be a courier for her as well throughout the first couple of years of the war and get through enemy lines whenever Rose Greenhow could not go herself. Number 9, Elizabeth Van Lew, spied for the Union and evaded capture. So we've talked about several women that were spies for the South, but this is the first one we've talked about who was a spy for the Union. And she was actually in the South. So you can see here, she was a pro-Union spy. She evaded capture during her missions into Confederate territory. She was born in Richmond in 1818. And in July of 1861, began volunteering as a nurse at the Libby prison, where she also supplied provisions for Union prisoners and relayed messages concealed inside book spines. Seeking to further contribute to the Union effort, Elizabeth devised a plan involving a formerly enslaved woman, Mary Jane Richards, to infiltrate the Confederate White House, and it was highly successful. She and Mary gathered info from President Davis and his family over a critical 2-year period between 1863 and 1864. In addition to Mary Jane Richards, several free and enslaved African Americans were also involved in Elizabeth Van Lew's 12-person network of white and black spies. So pretty amazing. She started working with Mary, but then her network grew to the point where she had 12 total agents working for her. And she was basically canvassing the Richmond area. Number 10, we just mentioned Mary Jane Richards, the former slave who turned spy for the Union. That's a picture of her there. And there's a picture at the bottom right there of Jefferson Davis and his family. Throughout her lifetime, Mary went by several pseudonyms. She was Mary Jane Bowser, Mary Elizabeth Bowser, Richmonia Richards, and Mary J. Denman. She was born sometime between 39 and 41. She was enslaved by Elizabeth Van Lew's parents, John Van Lew and Eliza Louise Baker Van Lew. The Van Lew family brought in Mary prior to the outbreak of the Civil War. During the war, Elizabeth arranged for her to spy in the Confederate White House in Richmond, Virginia. At the recommendation of one of Elizabeth's friends, Mary began serving at events hosted in the Davis Mansion and was eventually hired by the First Lady of the Confederacy, Verena Howell Davis. Mary would gather info, write it on small parchments per Elizabeth's instructions, and they would meet up several times a week on the property to exchange the documents for Elizabeth's transmit to Union officers. According to Union spy recruiter Thomas McNiven, Mary had a photographic memory. Everything she saw on the rebel president's desk, she would repeat word for word. So you talk about what an asset to have inside the Confederate president's house. Somebody who was working as a servant, but who had a photographic memory. Number 11, William Jackson was a former coachman for Jefferson Davis. He also turned spy and worked for the Union. He was an enslaved man whose enslaver, G.W. Tyrer, hired him out as President Davis's coachman in the summer of 1861 in Richmond. Jackson managed to escape and decided to become a spy for the Union. He provided Union Major General Irvin McDowell some insights about Davis's general morale and personal struggles over the war effort, as well as details about the Confederate fortifications in Richmond, which helped the Union later in the war when they ransacked the city. According to Rose Greenhow, Jackson had frequent interviews with President Lincoln at the White House. So you can imagine what some of those interviews were between Lincoln and Jackson. During their conversations, which Jackson reported to local press, Jackson provided information about the evacuation of Richmond during the Union Army's advance and shared that President Davis devised a tunnel system with General Robert E. Lee to facilitate his safe escape from the city. There's a really excellent book there on the left called Lincoln's Spies. Highly recommend you read that one. And in that, a lot of these spies we've already talked about, along with William Jackson, are talked about in great length. Number 12, Lincoln sat in Jefferson Davis's chair in the Confederate White House. So on April 3rd, 1865, Union forces under the command of General Ulysses S. Grant captured the Richmond White House, causing the Confederate government to flee. And you can see a picture of it there. That's Lincoln and Ulysses Grant and the whole Union Army coming into Richmond and taking over. A network of spies in Richmond worked secretly for the Union had been instrumental in the Union capturing the city. The next day, President Lincoln traveled by boat and horseback to visit the former home of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who had fled. According to a Richmond Whig newspaper article, a crowd surrounded the mansion and sent up a cheer after cheer as the president entered the doorway to the entrance hall of the Southern White House. Lincoln reached the state dining room and seated himself in the reception room and reception chair of Jefferson Davis. So you can just imagine what that felt like for Lincoln to finally have captured Richmond and to be sitting in the seat of his rival from the South. From the state dining room, Lincoln moved to the center parlor where he proceeded to interview representatives of the former Confederate government for 4 hours, who sought an audience with him to discuss the treatment of ex-Confederates. So some of them were talking to him about, we hope that you don't hang us. We hope that you treat us well. Others were actually providing him additional intelligence as to what they're going to be facing to finish the war. Following the capture of Richmond, President Lincoln returned to Washington, D.C., where he delivered his final public address about Reconstruction from the window above the north door of the White House, April 11th, 1865, which was approximately 1 month prior to the official end of the Civil War. Number 13, Harriet Tubman. We heard a little bit about her in the video. She was a liberator and a soldier and a spy master. One of the most celebrated heroines in American history, Harriet Tubman, perhaps best known for ushering enslaved people to freedom through the Underground Railroad in the 1850s. But not everyone knows that courageous Tubman, who escaped slavery in 1849, set up a vast espionage ring for the Union during the Civil War. It's really pretty amazing when I was researching this. In early 1862, with the support of abolitionist friends in the North, Tubman traveled to South Carolina, where she served as a nurse and teacher for the hundreds of newly liberated slaves who had assembled in Union camps. She soon recruited groups of black men who slipped behind Confederate lines, posing as servants or enslaved people in order to gather military intelligence. She also organized dangerous missions in which the Union troops destroyed plantations and spirited formerly enslaved people away on warships. In June 1863, Tubman herself led an armed expedition along the Combahee River, disrupting Confederate supply lines and liberating more than 700 enslaved people. So you can see she had a large period of time when she was releasing enslaved people in the 1850s, but then later in 1862 and 1863, she liberated many, many more slaves. And of course, was the first woman to ever lead a military operation. Her spy network was so effective, apparently, several Confederate generals wrote later that her intelligence that she provided and her network provided was devastating to the South. 14, Allan Pinkerton's Secret Service for the Union. We mentioned Pinkerton a little bit earlier in the program. He was the founder of his own detective agency in Chicago, Illinois, and had collected intelligence for Union General George B. McClellan during the first months of the Civil War, while McClellan led the Department of Ohio. When President Lincoln summoned McClellan to Washington late that summer, the general put Pinkerton in charge of intelligence for the Army of the Potomac. And Pinkerton set up the first Union espionage operation in mid-1861. He called himself codename E.J. Allen. Pinkerton built a counterintelligence network in Washington and sent undercover agents to ingratiate themselves in the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Pinkerton's intelligence reports from the field during 1862's Peninsula Campaign calculated Confederate troop movements and numbers, fueling McClellan's repeated calls for reinforcements and additional preparations for battle. Though he called his operation the U.S. Secret Service, Pinkerton actually worked only for McClellan. Union military intelligence was still decentralized at the time, as generals and even President Lincoln employed their own agents to seek out information and report back. So Pinkerton was a big deal back then, but he was one of several of the spy masters for the Union. Number 15, Kate Warren saved Lincoln's life early in the Civil War. You see a picture of Kate Warren there. On March 4th of 1861, this is very early in the war, Abraham Lincoln climbed into an open carriage and traveled to the United States Capitol to be sworn in as the country's 16th president. There, in his inaugural address, he movingly called for unity in the deeply divided nation, famously appealing to the better angels of our nature. It's possible Lincoln might never have made it to Washington, D.C. at all. He was openly despised by Southerners for his vocal opposition to slavery. He had been receiving daily death threats since his election. One of those threats might well have been carried out if not for the efforts of America's first female private detective, who was hired by the famed Pinkerton Detective Agency, Kate Warren, with her assistant female detective, Hattie Lawton. They not only sniffed out the details of an assassination attempt around Lincoln, but she successfully fronted a scheme to foil the conspirators who planned to ambush the president-elect during his train journey to Washington. Warren reminded Pinkerton that there were places to which it was impossible for male detectives to gain access, but that as a woman, she could go and worm out secrets. So again, pointing to the discussion we had earlier in the program, a lot of times women were much more effective spies than men were, and it was for some of these types of reasons she's talking about. There's just places where women could get into and men could not. And Warren was one of those very effective agents for Pinkerton. Number 16, being a spy in the Civil War got you executed. Although most spies were civilians and met jail time, many were court-martialed and faced death. Union citizen Timothy Webster was the first spy executed during the Civil War, and his picture's there on the left. He quickly had befriended Confederate officers who gave him tours of defenses and other strategic areas. He relayed information to Pinkerton and his spies for years until he fell very ill in Richmond and was apprehended by Confederates at the hospital. He was actually in the hospital for 3 to 4 months. And while he was there, they got suspicious of him. And he ended up hanging for his spying activities after they interrogated him for 2 weeks. Sam Davis joined the Confederacy and was assigned as a courier for Coleman's scouts. And you can see there Sam Davis on the right with a hat on. Coleman Scouts were an espionage group known to be the eyes and ears for the Tennessee Army. Davis and the Scouts participated in collecting information about Union troop movements and future attacks of the Confederacy. He was captured in November of 1863 and was carrying valuable information regarding Union troops along with intel items, including newspapers for Braxton Bragg. Davis faced a hasty trial where he was found guilty of espionage. Union General Grenville Dodge offered to spare Davis if he would expose other spies within the Union and Confederacy. Davis refused, despite knowing of spies within the area, and he was sentenced to hang. So as you can see, both these men reached the death penalty, unfortunately, for their espionage activities. Sam Davis actually wrote a letter to his mother down below, very sad there. Dear mother, oh, how painful it is to write you. I have got to die tomorrow morning, to be hanged by the Federals. Mother, do not grieve for me. I must bid you goodbye forevermore. Mother, I do not fear to die. Give my love to all. Your son, Samuel Davis. Number 17, Thomas Nelson Conrad was a preacher spy. You can see the picture of Conrad there. Conrad enlisted as a chaplain in the Confederate Army. And so you can imagine what a cover for a spy, a chaplain. He was assigned as a scout for the 3rd Virginia Cavalry. The 24-year-old Methodist preacher often made use of his chaplain garb when crossing into Union lines. Once Conrad began operating in Washington, D.C., he established a spy operation in the Von Ness House, a mansion owned by Confederate sympathizer and located near the White House. A contact at the War Department aided Conrad's efforts to acquire information about the composition and movement of Union forces. The intelligence Conrad provided proved useful to the South in several major battles of the war. He included documents he furnished to Confederate General Robert E. Lee about Union Army activities during the 7 Days Battle in mid-1862, enabling Lee's army to outmaneuver the stronger Union forces. Later that year, Conrad learned of Union Army plans to march south through Fredericksburg, Virginia, where Lee was headquartered. It was one of several reports Lee received about advancing Northern forces, and in the subsequent Battle of Fredericksburg, Confederates won their most lopsided battle of the war. So you can see Conrad was a really, really great informant for them. There's a letter there on the bottom side to Conrad thanking him for his service by Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Number 18, Union spying services. So we mentioned earlier that unlike the South, that was much more coordinated in their networks, Union had different services set up. We had the Bureau of Military Information. This was Major General John C. Fremont's organized group of spies to gain intelligence for forces in the Union Army. These spies wore Confederate uniforms and entered behind enemy lines, distinguishing their appearance from real Confederate soldiers by tying their white scarves in a special way, so each of them knew which each one was. They would sometimes carry back written intelligence reports wrapped in tinfoil inside their cheek. So literally put it in tinfoil and then you put it inside their mouth as they would take it back. We also had another service called the U.S. Secret Service. We mentioned this earlier, being Alan Pinkerton's organization. George P. McClellan actually hired Alan Pinkerton to set up the U.S. Secret Service, which began as the first Union intelligence operation in mid-1861. Secret Service operated throughout the war until Union victory. You can see some of the pictures of some of the operatives up there on the top left, some of the Union operatives. Number 19, Confederate spying services. Of course, they had just the one that was the secret line. They set up this intelligence service, which was a team of Confederate intelligence operators who had the job of passing secret messages from Richmond Confederate officials in the Washington-Baltimore region. This group used every method possible, by train, by horse, by foot, by carriage, special drop places, hidden in clothes. Confederacy's first secret service agent was James D. Bullock. In 1861, almost immediately after the attack on Fort Sumter, Bullock traveled to Liverpool, England, to establish a base of operations. Britain was officially neutral in the conflict between the North and South, but private and public sentiment favored the Confederacy. Britain was also willing to buy cotton that could be smuggled past Union blockades, which provided the South with its only real source of hard currency. Bullock established a relationship with the shipping firm Fraser, Trenholm and Company. to buy and sell Confederate cotton, using this currency to purchase arms and ammunition and uniforms and other supplies. Bullock was also the mastermind of the Confederate Navy. So very, very important operative. He was sitting in England, but he had a big impact over in the war in the Americas. Other spying techniques, use of mail. Union officials and Confederate officials both looked through mail correspondence in an effort to find information about enemy forces. You can imagine that your mail wasn't safe back then. So if you wanted to have a message that was secret, you had to encode it. Both of them tried to hide their communications in the mail. For example, to make sure large amounts of mail did not arrive suspiciously to the same address, Confederate spies established multiple addresses to form a network of mail recipients to help in the war effort. The individual addresses were made up mostly of unpaid volunteers. Both sides used coded messages and ciphers and other hidden techniques to transmit messages in letters and other forms of mail. And you can see one of the mail trucks there that was pulled by horse. And then also, actually, the middle picture there is what one of the temporary mail services looked like. 21, Aaron Van Camp was a dentist and spied for the Confederacy. So Aaron Van Camp was an espionage agent for the Confederacy during the Civil War. He and his son, Eugene Van Camp, were members of the Rose O'Neill Greenhow Confederate spy ring, which in 1861 was broken up by Allan Pinkerton. Van Camp was a well-known dentist in Washington, D.C., and after his arrest and imprisonment in the old Capitol prison, he was paroled in early 1862. So you can see the old prison there in the top right corner. That's the prison where many Confederates and Confederate spies were placed when they were captured. The picture there in the middle is Eugene Van Camp, which is Aaron Van Camp's son. He was also a spy and operative as well. So after Aaron Van Camp was released in 1862, during the remainder of the Civil War, he continued spying for the Confederacy. In January 1864, both Van Camps were to have reported have been engaging in spying activities for the Confederates in Vicksburg, Mississippi area, according to a confidential letter sent to U.S. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton. They were alleged to be conducting such espionage under the cover of trading in cotton. In April 1864, Van Camp arranged to secure a trading permit for Eugene to open a store at the Union-controlled Fort Pillow in Kentucky. In an attack by Confederate cavalry on the command of Nathan Bedford Forrest a few days later, Eugene was badly wounded by a Confederate minie-ball and was evacuated by Union forces to Illinois and then to New York for treatment. Aaron continued his spying activities until the war was over, and then he retired. So pretty amazing, the two of these gentlemen gave up their lives for the Confederate cause and really provided a lot of intelligence. Number 22, Henry Thomas Harrison, also known as Harrison, was a spy for the Confederacy Lieutenant General James Longstreet during the American Civil War. He's best known for the information he gave Longstreet and General Lee in the Gettysburg campaign, which resulted in Lee converging on Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, thus causing the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863. In April 1863, Harrison met Lieutenant General James Longstreet of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia during the Battle of Suffolk. From that point on, Harrison provided information for Longstreet, which usually proved to be reliable. Also, to maintain loyalty of his prize spy, Longstreet frequently paid Harrison in U.S. gold coins and greenbacks, which were significantly more valuable than Confederate currency. On the night of June 28, 1863, Harrison accurately reported to Longstreet that the Union Army had moved into Frederick, Maryland, and was moving northward, as well as the fact that Major General Joseph Hooker had been replaced as commander of the United States Army of the Potomac by Major General George Meade. Longstreet passed this information on to General Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. So you can see Henry Thomas Harrison, although working for the Confederacy for just a short time, was very effective in his information. There's a picture of him there in the top left. And then, of course, the bottom left is Longstreet's picture. Number 23, Virginia Bethel Moon and Charlotte Lottie Moon Clark were sister spies for the Confederates. So the picture on the top right is Virginia Bethel Moon, and the bottom right is Charlotte Lottie Moon Clark. During the Civil War, Virginia Moon was sent to live with her much older sister Lottie Moon Clark in Ohio after she was expelled from school. The Clark's home was a stopping point for Confederate couriers. Virginia eventually moved to Memphis, Tennessee. Eventually, both sisters began to help move information back from north to south and vice versa. And they smuggled the much needed information and quinine and morphine into the Confederacy. They often disguised themselves. Once they were caught smuggling medicine quilted into their voluminous hoop skirts. Virginia Moon had written a message hidden on her person. When the men who captured her insisted that the women be searched, Virginia pulled a gun on them and threatened to shoot any men who attempted to search her. When the men went to find a woman to search them, the women were left alone. In those few minutes, Virginia Moon dipped the message into water and ate it. So she got rid of it by eating the message. On another occasion, Virginia Moon, her sister, and her mother were caught by her sister Lottie's jilted fiance, General Ambrose Burnside, who kept them under house arrest for several months but never pressed charges. It's pretty amazing what these sisters and their mother did for the Confederacy and the network that they built in between Tennessee and Ohio and back and forth. Number 24, Pauline Cushman, one of the most successful Civil War spies on either side. You see a picture of her in the top left in her regular gear, and then in the middle, she was dressed as a Union soldier. She was actually an actress before the war, and then became a spy for the Union during the American Civil War. After an acting performance, Cushman was paid by two local pro-Confederate men to toast Confederate President Jefferson Davis after her performance. The theater company forced her to quit due to this toast, but she had other ideas. She decided to ingratiate herself with the rebels by making the toast while offering her services to the Union as a spy. By fraternizing with rebel military commanders, she managed to conceal battle plans and drawings in her shoes. She was actually caught twice in 1864 and brought before the Confederate General Braxton Bragg. She was tried in military court and sentenced to death by hanging. So she would have been the first death by hanging by a woman. Though she was already ill, she acted much worse off than she was, since she obviously was an actress. The Confederates had to postpone her execution. Cushman was spared hanging by the invasion of the area by Union troops. She was also wounded twice as a Union soldier. Some reports state that she returned to the South in her role as a spy after being wounded in battle, dressed in a male uniform. She was awarded the rank of Brevet Major by General James A. Garfield and made an honorary major by President Abraham Lincoln for her service to the federal cause. She became known as Miss Major Pauline Cushman. By the end of the war in 1865, she was touring the country giving lectures on her exploits as a spy. So this is a pretty amazing woman, the things she accomplished. 25, Grenville M. Dodge served as Ulysses S. Grant's intelligence chief. As we talked about earlier, each of the major generals had their own spy master, and this was Grant's. Dodge served as Grant's intelligence chief in the Western Theater. He served in several notable assignments, including command of the 16th Corps during the Atlanta campaign. He later commanded troops against Native Americans and served as a U.S. congressman, a businessman, a railroad executive who helped direct the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Historian Stanley P. Hershon suggested that Dodge, by virtue of his range of activities and abilities, could be considered more important in the national life after the Civil War than his more famous colleagues and friends, Grant, Sherman, or Sheridan. Dodge created a highly effective intelligence gathering network, which later proved vital to Grant's operations and was a precursor to the modern intelligence corps of the United States Army. It was one of the largest of the war, funded by the proceeds of captured Confederate cotton. With over 100 agents, they were so effective that their identities remain a mystery even today. It was perhaps the most accurate and comprehensive intelligence gathering network in the history of that time. His organization, which later became part of the Union Bureau of Military Information, helped Dodge ensure order defeat General John Bonnevier Villepugue near the Hatchie River, capture Colonel W. Faulkner's command of partisan Rangers near Island Number 10, and defeat General Earl Van Dorn at the Battle of Tuscumbia during his service with the Army of the Mississippi, and was later vital in the capture of Vicksburg under Grant. So not only was he an amazing operator as a spy, but he was an amazing military leader as well. And of course, later in life, did huge things like create our transcontinental railroad. So Grenville Dodge really had a lot going on and accomplished a lot of things for the country. Union spies networks were decentralized. We've mentioned this a little bit earlier. While Confederacy were much more focused on getting all their couriers and information through the secret line, Union did not have a similar system. Union generals handed their intelligence gathering as a task to their own commands. You can see there two of the individuals we talked about in this presentation today, Lafayette Baker and Alan Pinkerton. And also we talked about Dodge, who we just reviewed. Even so, Pinkerton called himself the chief of the United States Secret Service. A similar claim came after the war from Lafayette Baker, who performed counterintelligence and oversaw security for Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Army. So a lot of these guys really looked at themselves as the top guy, but in reality, there were multiple guys that were top guys for the Union. Civil War technology. Lots of really cool gadgets came in the Civil War that were not available in the Revolutionary War. You can see some really great goggles up top there that were used. We had the telegraph machine. You could actually send telegraphs to each other over a line. Down on the bottom left there was a canteen, a water canteen that was given to a regular soldier but could be used in this way to actually store messages and smuggle spy information. You had trap doors being used for intelligence drops. You had hoop skirts. You heard mentioned earlier the sister spies were using hoop skirts to tie information and other things into their hoop skirt itself. You had submarines that became much more prevalent in the Civil War. They had actually really come along a long way in 70 years, and they were using submarines both for battle and for spying. You had the air balloons. You heard that mentioned in the video, that air balloons became a big deal. The Union was well ahead of the South, but the South also employed them. They could send the air balloons way up in the air, and some of them could carry as many as 3 to 5 men. And they could actually scout out how many troops were on the other side in a battle that they were about to enter. So they had a really good idea of what they were facing. You had a cipher machine up at the top right up there, used to decode messages and made it much easier and faster to decode them. You can see all the different spy instruments that were used back then, all kinds of different telescopes and watches and different ways to store information in some of these devices. And then you can see down the bottom right there, a really cool watch that could turn into actually a photography machine. It could actually take photographs once it popped out. So a spy could carry this pocket watch in their pocket and never have any suspicion come upon them, but then at the right time, pop it out and take a photograph. So a lot of really cool technology came in during the Civil War, and it really changed the game. So I hope you enjoyed that. I always really like digging into all the different angles of the topic that we're talking about, especially this one, which is the spying during the American Civil War. It was a huge difference maker on both sides. In the end, the 1863 to 1865 time period, the Union caught up with the South and started using all kinds of methods to spy and to gather information. It really became decisive for them in their victory in the war. So I hope you enjoyed that. You can just do endless research on the amount of spying and espionage that happened in the Civil War. It is so fascinating, so much to learn. There's a lot of great books and materials out there for you to dig into. And really, thank you very much for joining today, and look for some of our other episodes that are coming. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We have a lot of good material coming your way. And thank you very much, and have a great evening.